a new movement in psychology called flow or optimal experience psychology. These various branches of our scientific examination of what is it that makes an individual human being prosperous and happy, both happy in terms of his internal experience or her internal experience, but prosperous in terms of their ability to function and integrate well into the world, go to work today and do a good job on your job. That the same thing that business was finding out for other reasons, all of these sciences are finding out as well, that in terms of what is it that makes somebody healthy, what is it that helps somebody become psychologically or physically rehabilitated, what is it that allows somebody to sustain their creativity, what is the how is it that self-esteem is damaged, for example. And we work very closely with the California Task Force of Self-Esteem. In fact, its founder is a friend of mine. That kind of at the core of all of these different disciplines about individual well-being is this notion that not only do I learn, but that most of I is learned. That it's how I learn to use myself, how I learn to listen to you, how I learn to mediate my experience, how I've learned to do mathematics or approach a problem, that it's this kind of deep learning which is at the core of how somebody behaves, how healthy somebody is, how relevant they are to the day-to-day practicalities of their function on the job, as well as to how well they can relate to other human beings. So my point here, and unfortunately, I could tell you right now that I normally spend a couple of hours on what today we can only spend about 20 minutes on. So it's kind of cryptic right now as I get to the technology part where hopefully we can have a little bit more engagement. But again, what I want to do here is say, just like we did with business a moment ago, that parallel to the business stream, there's another stream of research that's been going on that at the core of it, the very ground of this research being done, what it's coming down to is how well somebody is able to participate in the flow of their own experience in terms of their experience of their diet or their relationships with other human beings or their own physical body in the case of rehabilitation, that all of these things are connected to what is it that makes somebody both healthy and happy, and that what we would characterize all that as is a learning orientation. That the science of individual wellness, like the science of organizational science, is saying what we need are people and systems that are learning oriented. There's this remarkable agreement that's starting to occur, and that's what I'm trying to draw our attention to right now. That whether it's in business or it's in the science of wellness, what's being called forth by the pressures, both financial and scientific, are that we become better learners, that we become more oriented to our experience, our process of experiencing, in a way that we could characterize as more learning oriented. So that brings us to education. And there's actually a series of other fields that we could go into. But I want to talk for a moment about education and the various theories that have evolved over the past couple of decades, some of which are popular, some of which are fading, and tie back to the points we just made about business and individual well-being, that education is ultimately saying the same thing, that the core of success in education is how well is somebody participating in their own learning process. And this is very obvious, but it's not very obvious. I mean, it's very obvious at one level that we could have a discussion about, and it's very invisible at another. So I would like to take a few moments to go into that. Perhaps before I do, is there anything about individual well-being that anybody would like to go into for a bit? Okay. I'm sure that everybody here is familiar with the terms up there on the screen at this point, from developmental stages such as Piaget's work and Papert's work and others, considerations or problems attendant to the transfer of learning. What is it that allows learning experiences to really transfer, or what we would call co-implicate into somebody at a level in which they become called up as resources in a more creative way than in a more mechanical way. Critical thinking. What is the ground of critical thinking? How do we differentiate tool using from the process of becoming a good tool user? Okay. Constructionism, the idea of curriculum being a series of objectives that learners, like following a ski boat, pull themselves behind through the learning experiences that we want them to have, but without the learning experiences being set up in little boxes that we dunk them in. Learning style theory, that in the United States anyway, there's probably been a half a dozen different learning style theoreticians that have come along in the past 20 years that are basically talking about things that one might consider a modification on Carl Jung's original archetypes. That they've said that there's so many basic types, and some theorists have taken it and broken it out to 64 different variations, and some still stay with the original 4. But the core idea is very simple, that different people, based on a different personal evolutionary process, learn differently. I mean, everybody's mother knew that one. It's not a big deal, but education was kind of late to come to this, not so much because of a problem in the desire to do that, but in the problems of practicality in doing that, in that whether we're talking about a textbook, one size fits all, or we're talking about a classroom where arguably less than a textbook, but there's still this pervasive need to generalize rather than particularize or personalize. So learning style theories just come along to say louder and louder that we need to have educational experiences that can be personally differentiated by learners according to their different biases, their different needs. And learning style theory tends to break that into sensory biases, people that are more auditory, more visual, more kinematic, and cognitive biases, people that need things in a more serialized, concrete, step way, or people that might prefer something that's more story or emergent or poetic or mythopoetic. Multiple intelligences. Anybody here not heard of Howard Gardner's work on frames of intelligence? Everybody's on that? Okay. The learning to learn movement is starting to sweep across the United States in terms of it's kind of a banner to organized thinking, that what we want to do is ultimately develop in our students some capacity to be learning to learn, that we're beginning to see that more and more as the catch-all, the place where everything else meets. I've touched on these things very briefly, each one of these points, from developmental stages to learn. Each one of these things could be a half-a-day conversation. What I want to do right now is just hope that I've dropped them and said what I want to do is gather them together, kind of assume we all understand what those mean, at least in some general level, and then move from there to talk about how we can envision how all of these things participate, perhaps in a different way of looking at the learning process. So, was there any questions about any one of these things that we might sync up on before I go to the next step?